In popular imagination, the Pacific War is mostly known for tropical fighting on far-flung islands. But in the initial months of the conflict, Japan engaged in a series of attacks on the American mainland. The last of these was the most audacious, the first attack by a foreign invader on a military base in the contiguous United States since Fort McHenry nearly 150 years earlier. It's the Battle of Fort Stevens near Astoria, Oregon. I want to be completely upfront and transparent. I have no affiliation with Kings and Generals, but I am a huge fan of their work, certainly including their brilliant Pacific War week-by-week series. So I thought it would be fun to add some supplemental information, as well as the on-the-ground perspective of one of their most interesting episodes. Week 34, Japan attacks the continental United States. Fort Stevens is located just west of Astoria, Oregon, on the northwest tip of the state by the mouth of the Columbia River, the largest Pacific-bound river in North America. The fort was completed in 1864 during the American Civil War. Oregon had by this point achieved full statehood and was on the Union side, while across the river the Washington Territory had not yet achieved statehood but was also on the Union side. The initial installation was named the Fort at Point Adams, though it was quickly renamed the next year, honoring Isaac Stevens, the first governor of the Washington Territory and later one of the Union's most senior generals, who had been killed while personally leading a charge at the Battle of Chantilly back east 3 years earlier. Meanwhile, the fort also continued to expand. By the turn of the 20th century, Fort Stevens had been joined by two other installations, both across the river in Washington, by now a fully fledged state within the Union. The first, at Cape Disappointment, came to be known as Fort Canby, while the second, Fort Columbia, was on a bluff overlooking the center of the channel to the ocean. The trio came to be known as the Three-Fort System of Astoria's coastal defense, organized by the United States Harbor Defense Command. The installations at Fort Stevens began to grow significantly, especially after the recent warfare against Spain in the Pacific, as well as ongoing tensions with the British over the Alaskan frontier. Fort Stevens began to expand on its number of personnel as well as its defense capabilities. With America entering World War I after Pacific action had concluded, the fort's guns were not upgraded at that time, thus gradually became somewhat outdated. Still, the fort packed plenty of firepower, and Astoria's three-fort defense system for the mouth of the Columbia seemed ironclad. In 1932, the American Navy set up a radio intercept station at the fort. There, specially trained radio operators would listen in on Japanese naval communications and coded messages. In September of 1939, just after the war in Europe had broken out, but prior to America's involvement in the Pacific, the Navy relocated this program to Fort Ward near the naval base at Bremerton, Washington, across Puget Sound from Seattle. Meanwhile, the Army, along with the Oregon National Guard, continued to upgrade the facilities at Fort Stevens, as well as those at Fort Canby and Fort Columbia, though the gun emplacements had not yet received an overdue upgrade as of the time of the outbreak of war a little over 2 years later in December 1941. Following the outbreak of war, the Imperial Japanese Navy staged several attacks on the west coast of continental North America, as illustrated by Kings and Generals, including attacks on oil infrastructure such as tankers, and oil fields themselves. A minor attack also took place on the coast of Vancouver Island, north of the Canadian border in British Columbia. This caused a significant amount of paranoia in American society. Rumors swirled that a large-scale Japanese attack was imminent. The heightened sense of suspicion that accompanied these early Japanese attacks was on full demonstration during the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, where the city's anti-aircraft batteries opened up on what is now assumed to have been a weather balloon, firing wildly in all directions at what turned out to be a phantom enemy. Several deaths resulted as a byproduct of this, and the fact that there were no Japanese planes was not revealed to the public at the time, so it was widely assumed that this was indeed the largest and boldest Japanese attack yet, even further heightening the sense of paranoia in the opening months of the war. This widespread fear was also, of course, manifest in more regrettable ways. By the summer of 1942, however, many on the West Coast, both civilian and military, were beginning to let their guard down. At this time, Fort Stevens was manned by National Guardsmen, specifically the 249th Coastal Artillery of the Oregon National Guard. The fort's commander was Lieutenant Colonel Lifton M. Irwin. The I-25 was a Japanese submarine of the I-15 class. With Lieutenant Commander Akiji Tagami at the controls of the I-25, it undertook several long-distance solo missions, armed with a lone torpedo, a 5.5-inch deck gun, and even carried its own float plane for reconnaissance or small-scale raids. On the night of June 21st, just prior to midnight, the I-25 silently approached Fort Stevens and the Columbia River, traveling beneath the surface and following a fleet of fishing boats to locate the river's entrance. It was thought by the Japanese that American submarines were based in Astoria, and because of that, the Columbia River and Fort Stevens became an even more high-profile target than they would have been anyway. What happened next, however, is not exactly clear. What is known for sure is that the submarine proceeded to surface and fired between 9 and 17 artillery rounds at Fort Stevens. The Kings and Generals video shows Tagami approaching the fort from the west. Lieutenant Colonel Irwin then notices the submarine surfacing in the mouth of the Columbia, off the fort's main batteries. But this would have been a very difficult position for the I-25 to have reached. Not only do the main batteries of Fort Stevens have a perfect line of fire to the inside of the Clatsop Spit, ranging from the river's mouth over to the town of Ilwaco on the Washington side, but also on the Washington side was Fort Canby, guarding the river's mouth itself, which would likely have fired upon the submarine as soon as it surfaced. As well as Fort Columbia, which had an ideal line of fire from the bluffs facing directly toward the river's mouth. In addition, mines had been laid across the mouth of the Columbia, which could be manually detonated from each of the three forts. All these factors combined to make it a difficult, if not seemingly impossible task for the I-25 to have infiltrated so far up the river's mouth, despite this happening in the middle of the night and the relatively low readiness of the troops. The I-25's deck gun then opened up on Fort Stevens, launching as many as 17 shells at the base, though 8 of these were reportedly either duds or fell short in the water. The one piece of evidence indicating that the submarine could have surfaced on the riverside is that one of these shells landed on the fort's baseball field and destroyed the backstop. For a little background, the Fort Stevens garrison had long formed its own baseball team, facing off against similar squads from Fort Columbia and Fort Canby. The field at Fort Stevens was reportedly located just behind the main battery, likely in this open area to the rear, on the river-facing side of the installation. The inaccuracy of this shell fire turned out to be the case across the board. None of the 9 shells that did explode within the fort's grounds hit anything significant, with most landing in the installation's swamps and ponds. This helps to further the idea that the submarine did not surface on the river side of the fort, but instead on the ocean side. Not only is it a much more conceivable position to reach, but if the Japanese were targeting the auxiliary battery Russell in the southwest corner of the base, then it would make sense for those shells to have landed in the ponds and swamps behind Battery Russell. This also seems corroborated by the stories of those serving in Battery Russell that night. The battery's commander, Captain Jack Wood, asked for permission to return fire. However, Lieutenant Colonel Irwin denied him the request, knowing that in the blackout conditions, the Japanese gunners could not spot the location of batteries within the fort, hence the inaccurate shelling, and thus barred his men from returning fire, which would have revealed their positions. This was understandably frustrating for the men of Battery Russell, but it is clear from their reactions that they were the ones in position to respond.
Battery Russell called in a few minutes and said, "Battery Russell, loaded and ready to fire." I repeated that to the colonel, and he discussed it with the other officers, and he turned back to me and said, "Tell them that I order them not to fire. I repeat, you will not fire." I gave this message to the operator, and he in turn turned to his officer and told him. And I heard over the phone, "Who in the hell gave that order?" And Colonel Doney was standing close enough to me that he could hear this message. And he told me, gave him the phone, and I did. And he said, "This is Colonel Doney. I told you you will not fire. If you fire one round, I'll court-martial the whole 249th.
We show here they're about 2,000 yards out of our range. And then certainly didn't make any sense to fire at something you couldn't reach and give your position away. We all wanted to go and engage. I mean, we'd been in intensive training here for a year and a half, and here was our chance.
Naturally, we're very frustrated. There was a lot of anger.
The officers were all a dedicated group of people who wanted to fight the war and win it.
The facetious rumor that was going around was they wouldn't let us fire because if they'd let us fire, then they would have had to pay us combat pay.
Regardless of the frustration of the men, Irwin's plan had succeeded in not giving away the base's firing positions. Having failed to crack open the entrance to the river, and with offensive capabilities exhausted, the I-25 was in a quite vulnerable position. At the time of the attack, a squad of A-29 Hudson bombers were running a nighttime training mission. They successfully located the I-25 and launched an airstrike. However, the submarine dodged the bombs, then submerged and headed west out of American coastal waters. Many local neighborhoods directly abut the base, and residents were shocked the next morning to find that exploded and unexploded shells had landed so close to their homes. It was a wake-up call for the residents, just as it was for the fort's garrison the night before, with a renewed sense of vigilance and an acute awareness that even on the American mainland, the war could come to their doorstep. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out the original content on Kings and Generals, including their entire Pacific War week-by-week series. Also, be sure to check out the project that forms the basis for this channel at apoliticalworldmap.org. If you enjoyed that content, please give the video a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you can, please donate on Patreon. For now, thanks so much for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.